Margaret Thompson had been up since 5 in the morning. At 78 years old, her body didn't let her sleep in anymore, even when she wanted to. She'd made herself a simple breakfast of toast and tea, the same thing she'd eaten for the past 50 years. The house felt too quiet these days. 6 months had passed since James died, and she still wasn't used to the silence. She looked at the envelope on her kitchen table. Inside was a check for James's military pension. He'd served in Vietnam, come home, and spent 40 years teaching history at the local high school. The pension wasn't much, but it helped. Without it, Margaret didn't know how she'd manage on just her own retirement from teaching English literature. She got dressed carefully, choosing a floral dress that James had always liked. It was a bit old-fashioned, maybe, but it made her feel closer to him somehow. She put on her grandmother's pearl necklace, the one her mother had given her on her wedding day. Her hands shook a little as she clasped it. They'd been shaking more lately. Getting old wasn't for the weak, that's what James used to say. Margaret grabbed her purse, the brown leather one with the worn handles. She'd had it for 20 years. James had offered to buy her a new one countless times, but she'd always refused. This one still worked just fine, she'd tell him. Why waste money on something new when the old one did the job? The bank was only a 15-minute drive away. Margaret didn't like driving much anymore, but she managed. The roads seemed busier than they used to be, everyone always in such a hurry. She parked carefully in the lot and made her way inside, holding the envelope tight in her hand. First National Bank was busy that Tuesday morning. Margaret took her place in line, patient as always. She'd taught middle school students for 40 years. If she could handle a classroom of 13-year-olds, she could handle waiting in line at a bank. When her turn came, she stepped up to the counter. The young man behind it barely looked at her. He was maybe in his late 20s, with styled hair and a name tag that read Brad. He was typing something on his computer, his fingers moving fast across the keyboard. "Can I help you?" he asked, still not looking up. "Yes, please. I need to deposit this check." Margaret placed the envelope on the counter and slid it toward him. Brad picked it up, finally glancing at her. His eyes moved from her face down to her dress to her old purse, then back to the check. Something changed in his expression. "It wasn't friendly. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Margaret blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" "This check. Where did it come from?" He was looking at her like she'd done something wrong. "It's my late husband's pension, his military pension." She kept her voice steady, even though something uncomfortable was starting to build in her chest. Brad held the check up to the light, examining it like it might be fake. People in line behind Margaret were starting to watch. She could feel their eyes on her back. "This seems like a lot of money," Brad said loudly. Too loudly. "Are you sure this is legitimate?" Margaret felt her face grow hot. "Of course it's legitimate. My husband served his country. He taught school for 40 years. This is his pension. Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you some questions." Brad's voice carried across the bank. Other tellers were looking now. Customers were staring. "How exactly did you come into possession of this check?" "I just told you," Margaret said, trying to keep her composure. Her hands were shaking worse now. "It's my husband's pension. They mail it every month. And your husband is where exactly?" "He passed away 6 months ago." Her voice cracked a little. She hated that it did. Brad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So you're trying to cash a check for a deceased person. Do you understand that's fraud?" Margaret's heart was pounding now. She could feel tears starting to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of all these people. No, you don't understand. The pension transfers to the spouse. I have all the paperwork. I've been depositing these checks for 6 months. This is my money. Ma'am, I'm going to have to call my supervisor. And security." Brad picked up his phone. "Security?" Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. This couldn't be happening. She'd never been in trouble in her life. She'd been a teacher, a Sunday school volunteer, a woman who'd never even gotten a speeding ticket. "You're being disruptive," Brad said, waving his hand dismissively. "Please step aside." Margaret stood there, frozen. The other customers were definitely staring now. Some looked sympathetic, but no one said anything. No one stood up for her. She felt small, humiliated, like a child being scolded in front of the class. She opened her purse with trembling hands. "I have my identification. I have James's death certificate. I have the letter from the Veterans Affairs Office. I brought everything. Ma'am, step aside now." Brad's voice was cold. That's when Margaret heard another voice behind her. It was deep, calm, but it carried a weight that made even Brad look up. What exactly is the problem here? Margaret turned slightly. Standing in line behind her was a tall, muscular man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. There was something familiar about him, but she was too upset to place it. A few other customers were looking at him strangely, like they were trying to figure out who he was. Brad straightened up a bit, suddenly less confident. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please wait your turn." The man didn't move. "I've been standing here for 10 minutes. I've watched this entire interaction. So I'm asking again, what's the problem?" "This woman is trying to deposit a fraudulent check," Brad said, but his voice wasn't as loud now. "Based on what evidence?" The man asked. Brad faltered. "Based on, it's suspicious. The amount, the circumstances. She told you it's her deceased husband's military pension. She offered to show you documentation. What part of that is suspicious?" Margaret looked at this stranger who was defending her. She wanted to thank him, but her throat felt tight. Brad's face was getting red now. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this is bank business. I'm following protocol." The man took off his sunglasses. That's when Margaret recognized him. That's when several other customers started pulling out their phones. It was Vin Diesel, the actor, the one from those car movies James used to love watching. "Then let's talk to someone who actually knows the protocol," Vin Diesel said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I want to speak to your manager. Right now." Brad's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The entire bank had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now. The manager is busy," Brad stammered. "Then get her unbusy," Vin said. "Because what I just witnessed was an elderly woman being accused of fraud for trying to deposit her late husband's pension check. I watched you humiliate her in front of everyone here. So either you get your manager, or I'm going to start making phone calls to people who will be very interested in how this bank treats its customers." Margaret felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up at Vin Diesel and he gave her a kind smile. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She wasn't okay, not really. But something about his presence made her feel less alone. Brad was already on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Within seconds, a woman in a business suit came rushing out from the back offices. Her eyes went wide when she saw who was standing at the counter. Things were about to change. Margaret could feel it. But the damage was already done. She'd been humiliated, treated like a criminal, all for trying to deposit a check that was rightfully hers. And if this famous man hadn't been standing in line behind her, she wondered if anyone would have helped her at all. The woman in the business suit looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her name tag read, Susan Chen, branch manager, and her face had gone pale the moment she saw Vin Diesel standing at the counter with his hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Mr. Diesel," she said, her voice a bit breathless. What seems to be the issue?" Vin didn't smile. His expression was serious, the kind Margaret had seen in his movies when he was about to tell someone they'd crossed a line. "The issue is that your employee just accused this woman of fraud in front of your entire bank. She came in to deposit her late husband's military pension, a completely legitimate transaction she's apparently been doing for 6 months, and instead of helping her, he called her a criminal and threatened to have security remove her." Susan's eyes darted to Brad, who was now standing very still behind the counter, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Mrs. Susan looked at Margaret Thompson. Margaret Thompson. Her voice was steadier now, though she could still feel the embarrassment burning in her chest. "Mrs. Thompson, I am so deeply sorry. This is absolutely not how we treat our customers. May I see your documentation?" Margaret reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out the envelope with the check. Her driver's license, James's death certificate, and the official letter from the Veterans Affairs Office explaining the pension transfer. She'd learned to carry all of it after the first time she'd deposited the check and the teller had questions, but never had anyone treated her like this. Susan reviewed each document carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "Everything here is completely in order. Mrs. Thompson, I cannot apologize enough for what happened. There was absolutely no reason for you to be treated this way. He made me feel like a thief," Margaret said quietly, "in front of all these people. I taught school for 40 years. My husband served his country. We've never done a dishonest thing in our lives." Several customers were still recording on their phones. Margaret noticed this and felt a fresh wave of humiliation. Now her worst moment was going to be on the internet for everyone to see. Vin must have noticed her discomfort because he turned slightly, positioning himself to block some of the camera angles. Maybe we could handle this somewhere more private? He suggested to Susan. Of course, absolutely. Mrs. Thompson, would you please come with me to my office? And Mr. Diesel, if you don't mind. I'm staying with her, Vin said firmly. If that's all right with you, Mrs. Thompson. Margaret looked up at this man she'd never met before today. This celebrity who could have just minded his own business and let her be humiliated alone. I'd appreciate that, she said softly. Susan led them to her office, a small room with a desk and a few chairs. She gestured for Margaret to sit in the most comfortable one, and quickly got her a glass of water. Margaret's hands were still shaking as she took it. Mrs. Thompson, I want to personally process your transaction, Susan said, sitting at her computer, and I want you to know that what happened out there is being taken very seriously. What's going to happen to Brad? Vin asked. He'd taken off his baseball cap and Margaret could see the genuine concern in his eyes. Susan's jaw tightened. That's a personnel matter. But I can assure you both that discrimination and the mistreatment of customers is not tolerated at First National Bank. An investigation will be opened immediately. An investigation? Margaret said. I just want to deposit my check and go home. Of course, and we'll do that right now. But Mrs. Thompson, what happened to you was wrong. It was discriminatory. Whether Brad realized it or not, he made assumptions about you based on your appearance, your age, and your race. That's not acceptable. Margaret had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it out loud. She'd dealt with racism before, of course. Growing up in the South in the 1940s and 50s, she'd seen things that still gave her nightmares. But she'd hoped things had gotten better. She'd believed they had gotten better. It still happens, Vin said gently as if reading her thoughts. It shouldn't, but it does. And when it happens, it needs to be called out. Susan finished processing the deposit. Done. Your check has been deposited, Mrs. Thompson. Is there anything else you need from us today? Margaret shook her head. She just wanted to leave, to go home and try to forget this whole horrible morning. Before you go, Susan said, I want to give you my direct phone number. If you ever have any issues, any questions, anything at all, you call me personally. And again, I am so very sorry for what you experienced. They left the office and walked back through the bank. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but a few people were still there watching. Brad was nowhere to be seen. Margaret kept her eyes straight ahead, clutching her purse. Once they were outside in the parking lot, Margaret finally let out a long breath. The morning sun was bright and she realized she'd been in that bank for almost an hour. It had felt like days. Thank you, she said to Vin. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he replied. I couldn't just stand there and watch that happen. Most people did. Margaret's voice was bitter. She'd seen their faces in line the way they'd watched but said nothing. I know, and that's part of the problem. Vin looked frustrated. People see things happening that they know are wrong, but they don't want to get involved. They don't want to make a scene. You made a scene, Margaret said, and despite everything, she felt the corners of her mouth turn up slightly. Vin laughed. Yeah, I guess I did. Are you okay to drive home? You're still shaking. Margaret looked down at her hands. He was right. I'll be fine in a minute. I just need to sit in my car for a bit. There's a coffee shop next door, Vin said, pointing to a small cafe she'd never noticed before. Would you let me buy you a cup of coffee? Or tea? Whatever you'd like. You shouldn't be alone right now. Margaret started to refuse. This man was famous. He probably had important places to be. But the truth was she didn't want to be alone. The thought of going back to her empty house, of sitting in that silent kitchen where James used to read the newspaper, made her chest hurt. Coffee would be nice, she said. If you're sure you have time. I have time, Vin assured her. I'm supposed to be on set in a few hours, but right now this is more important. They walked to the cafe together. Vin held the door open for her, and Margaret noticed how different people treated her when she was with him. The young barista smiled warmly at her, asked her how her day was going. When she was alone, people rarely saw her at all. They sat at a small table by the window. Vin ordered a black coffee. Margaret got tea with honey the way she always drank it. Tell me about your husband, Vin said. If you want to talk about it. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Nobody had asked her about James in weeks. Her children called sometimes, but they lived across the country and had their own busy lives. They meant well, but they didn't understand the loneliness. His name was James. We were married for 52 years. He was my high school sweetheart. She smiled at the memory. Everyone said we were too young to get married, but we knew. Sometimes you just know. What was he like? Vin leaned forward, genuinely interested. Stubborn, Margaret said and laughed. Oh, he was stubborn. But kind, so kind. He served in Vietnam, came home with nightmares he never quite shook. But he didn't let it make him bitter. He became a teacher because he said if he could help kids understand history, really understand it, maybe they wouldn't have to repeat the worst parts. Sounds like a good man. The best. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she let them fall. I miss him every single day. The house is too quiet. I make tea and forget he's not there to drink his cup. I turn to tell him something and remember all over again that he's gone. Vin reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. I lost my father too. It doesn't get easier exactly, but you learn to carry it differently. They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by grief and an incident at a bank. My father was a veteran too, Vin said finally. He didn't talk much about his service, but I knew it shaped him. Shaped our whole family, really. Margaret looked at this famous action star, this man who seemed larger than life on movie screens, and saw just a person, someone who'd experienced loss, someone who understood. Why did you help me? She asked. You could have just stayed quiet like everyone else. Vin was quiet for a moment, thinking. My mother raised me to stand up for what's right. And what was happening to you wasn't right. It was cruel and it was wrong, and I wasn't going to pretend I didn't see it. He paused. Plus, my dad would have been furious if I'd just stood there and done nothing while a veteran's widow was being mistreated. James would have done the same thing, Margaret said. If he'd seen someone being treated badly, he would have spoken up. They talked for another hour. Margaret told him about her years teaching, about the students who still sent her Christmas cards, about the time James surprised her with a trip to Paris for their anniversary. Vin told her about growing up in New York, about his stepfather who'd raised him, about how strange fame could be. Margaret got home and sat in her car for a few minutes before going inside. The house looked the same as it had when she'd left that morning, but somehow everything felt different. She felt different, shaken, yes, embarrassed, definitely, but also something else she couldn't quite name yet. She made herself another cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where she'd sat with James for 52 years. Her phone buzzed. It was her daughter calling from California. Mom, are you okay? I just saw a video on Facebook. Margaret's stomach dropped. What video? Someone posted a video from the bank. Mom, what happened? Why didn't you call me? For the next 20 minutes, Margaret explained the whole story to her daughter, who was furious. Then she had to explain it again when her son called from Texas. Then her sister called. Then her neighbor from 2 houses down who'd apparently also seen the video online. By evening, Margaret's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She didn't even have social media accounts, didn't really understand how they worked. But apparently the whole world was watching what had happened to her that morning. Her grandson called and walked her through how to look at Vin Diesel's Instagram page. There she saw the photo they'd taken outside the cafe. She looked small next to him, tired and older than she felt inside, but she was smiling. Vin had written a long caption about respect for elders, about standing up against discrimination, about how veterans and their families deserved better. The post had millions of likes. Millions. Margaret couldn't even comprehend that number. The comments section was full of people sharing their own stories. Elderly people who'd been treated poorly at stores, at hospitals, at government offices. People of color who'd been followed around in shops or questioned about their purchases. Veterans who'd been disrespected. The stories went on, and Margaret realized her experience wasn't unique at all. It was just the first time someone famous had been there to witness it. That night, she barely slept. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. Some were kind. Some were curious. A few were from reporters asking if they could interview her. She ignored those. The next morning, there was a knock at her door. Margaret looked through the peephole and saw Susan Chen, the bank manager, standing on her porch holding a large flower arrangement. Mrs. Thompson, Susan said when Margaret opened the door, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to come personally to apologize again and to let you know what actions we've taken. Margaret invited her in, though she felt strange having the bank manager in her living room. Susan sat on the edge of the couch looking uncomfortable. First, I want you to know that Brad no longer works for First National Bank. His employment was terminated yesterday afternoon. Second, we're implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff members. What happened to you should never happen to anyone. You fired him? Margaret felt a complicated mix of emotions. She'd been angry at Brad, furious even, but she also knew what it was like to lose a job. Mrs. Thompson, this wasn't Brad's first complaint. There have been other incidents, other customers who felt they were treated unfairly. Your situation was just the one that finally got attention because of who witnessed it. Susan paused.
That's part of the problem, isn't it?
People experience discrimination every day, but it only matters when someone important sees it. Margaret nodded slowly. That was exactly the problem. We want to make this right, Susan continued. The bank would like to offer you compensation for your distress. And we'd like to work with you on creating a better system for helping elderly customers and veterans' families. I don't want money, Margaret said firmly, but I do want things to change. Not just at your bank, everywhere. People shouldn't have to go through what I went through. They talked for another hour. Susan left her personal number again and promised to keep Margaret updated on the training implementation. After she left, Margaret sat in her living room, looking at the flowers Susan had brought. They were beautiful, but they didn't erase what had happened. Over the next few days, the story got bigger. News outlets picked it up. Local papers, then national news. Margaret's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She finally had to get her grandson to help her set up a voicemail. A reporter from a major news network came to her door, asking for an interview. Margaret almost said no, but then she thought about all those comments on Vin's post. All those people who'd had similar experiences. Maybe if she told her story it would help. The interview aired that evening. Margaret talked about James, about his service and his death. She talked about the humiliation of being accused of fraud for trying to access money that was rightfully hers. She talked about how invisible elderly people often feel, how people look through them instead of at them. I taught middle school for 40 years, she told the interviewer. I was somebody. I had students who became doctors and teachers and engineers. My husband served his country and educated hundreds of young people. But in that bank I was just an old woman who looked like she didn't belong. And that's the part that hurts the most. The interviewer asked if she'd heard from Vin Diesel since that day. Margaret smiled. He's checked in on me, sent his assistant to make sure I was okay with all the attention. He's a good man. He didn't have to help me, but he did. I think his parents raised him right. After the interview, something unexpected happened. Other banks started reaching out, asking Margaret to consult on their customer service policies. Organizations that worked with elderly citizens wanted her to speak at their events. A veterans advocacy group invited her to join their board. Margaret was overwhelmed. She was 78 years old. She'd been planning to spend her remaining years quietly, maybe doing some volunteer work at the library, visiting her grandchildren when she could. She hadn't planned on becoming some kind of accidental activist, but then she'd get messages from people thanking her. An elderly man in Michigan who'd been treated poorly at a pharmacy said he filed a complaint because Margaret's story gave him courage. A veteran's widow in Florida said she'd been too scared to apply for her husband's benefits, but now she was going to try. One afternoon, Margaret was sitting in her kitchen drinking tea when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. Mrs. Thompson, this is Patricia, Mr. Diesel's assistant. He wanted to know if you'd be available next week. He's having a premiere for his new film and would like to invite you as his guest. Margaret nearly dropped her phone. A movie premiere? I've never been to anything like that. Your children and grandchildren would be welcome too, Patricia said warmly. And don't worry about what to wear. Mr. Diesel would like to arrange for a stylist to help you if you'd like. Margaret didn't know what to say. Part of her thought it was ridiculous. A woman her age going to a fancy Hollywood premiere. But another part of her, the part that had been made to feel small and invisible in that bank, wanted to go. Wanted to get dressed up and be seen. Can I think about it? Margaret asked. Of course. Take your time. After she hung up, Margaret called her daughter. I think I'm going to a movie premiere. Her daughter screamed so loud Margaret had to hold the phone away from her ear. Mom, oh my God. I'm coming with you. We're all coming with you. This is incredible. That night, Margaret looked through her closet. She had her church dresses, her everyday clothes, but nothing appropriate for a red carpet. She'd never needed anything like that before. Her sister came over the next day with a bunch of fashion magazines. They sat at the kitchen table, looking at pictures of actresses in glamorous gowns, laughing at how different that world was from their own. "You should do it," her sister said. "You should go and have the time of your life. James would want you to." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "I keep thinking about what he'd say about all this. The video going viral, the news interviews, the movie premiere. He'd probably tell me I was being ridiculous." "No," her sister said firmly. "He'd be proud of you. You stood up for yourself. You're using what happened to help other people. That's exactly what James would do." Margaret made the call the next day. She told Patricia yes, she would love to attend the premiere. And yes, she would appreciate help with styling because she had no idea what to wear to something like that. The week before the premiere, a woman named Christina came to Margaret's house. She was a professional stylist, warm and friendly, and she didn't make Margaret feel foolish for not knowing about designer brands. They found a beautiful navy blue gown that was elegant, but not too flashy. Christina arranged for someone to do Margaret's hair and makeup the day of the event. "You're going to look absolutely stunning," she promised. Margaret's children flew in for the premiere. Her son from Texas, her daughter from California, and 2 of her grandchildren. They stayed at her house, filling it with noise and laughter for the first time since James died. The night before the premiere, they all sat around the dinner table eating the pot roast Margaret had made, James's favorite. Her grandson asked her if she was nervous. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "I've never done anything like this. What if I say something wrong? What if I trip on my dress? What if people think I don't belong there?" The morning of the premiere, Margaret woke up with butterflies in her stomach. She'd barely slept, kept waking up worried she'd oversleep or that the whole thing had been a dream. But when she looked at her phone, there was a text from Patricia confirming the car would pick them up at 4 o'clock. Her daughter had already been up for hours, practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Mom, do you realize how many people would kill for this opportunity? You're going to a real Hollywood premiere." Christina arrived at noon with a whole team. A hairstylist, a makeup artist, even someone to help with accessories. They'd transformed Margaret's small bedroom into a makeshift salon. Her grandchildren watched in amazement as the professionals worked their magic. "Grandma, you look like a movie star," her 10-year-old granddaughter whispered as they curled Margaret's silver hair into soft waves. The makeup artist was gentle, explaining everything she was doing. "We're just enhancing your natural beauty, Mrs. Thompson. You have wonderful bone structure." Margaret looked in the mirror and hardly recognized herself. The woman looking back was elegant, confident. Her silver hair glowed under the light. The makeup made her eyes sparkle in a way they hadn't in years. She looked like herself, but somehow more so. Then came the dress. The navy blue gown fit perfectly, falling in graceful lines that made Margaret stand a little taller. Christina added simple diamond earrings that caught the light and a delicate bracelet. "Mrs. Thompson," Christina said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look absolutely beautiful." Margaret's daughter started crying. "Mom, Dad would be so proud." Margaret felt her own eyes well up, but the makeup artist quickly handed her a tissue. "No crying yet. We need to preserve the makeup." The limousine arrived exactly at 4. Margaret had never been in a limousine before. Her grandchildren were beside themselves with excitement, taking pictures of everything. Her son kept making jokes to hide how emotional he was getting. As they drove through the city toward the theater, Margaret watched the streets go by. She'd lived here her whole life. She'd driven these roads countless times, going to work, taking her children to school, running errands with James. She'd never imagined she'd be in the back of a limousine, heading to a movie premiere. When they arrived at the theater, Margaret could hear the crowd before she could see them. There were barriers set up, photographers with huge cameras, fans screaming. Her heart started racing. "I can't do this," she said suddenly. "This is too much." "I'm just a retired schoolteacher." Her daughter squeezed her hand. "You're a retired schoolteacher who's been on national news, who stood up against discrimination, who inspired thousands of people. You absolutely can do this." The door opened and Patricia was there, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Thompson, you look stunning." "Are you ready?" "No," Margaret said honestly. But she took Patricia's offered hand anyway and stepped out of the car. The noise hit her like a wave. Cameras flashing, people shouting questions, fans cheering. Patricia guided her toward the red carpet where photographers were lined up waiting. "Just smile," Patricia said quietly. "Take your time. You don't have to rush." Margaret stepped onto the red carpet, her family behind her. The camera started flashing more intensely. She tried to smile, feeling awkward and exposed, but then she heard someone shout, "Mrs. Thompson, you look beautiful." Then another voice, "We love you, Margaret. Thank you for sharing your story." They weren't just photographers doing their job. Some of these people actually knew who she was, actually cared about her story. Margaret felt something shift inside her. She stood a little straighter, smiled a little wider. A reporter approached with a microphone. "Mrs. Thompson, how does it feel to be here tonight?" "Surreal," Margaret said honestly. "But wonderful. I never imagined anything like this would happen to me. Your story has touched millions of people. What do you want people to take away from what happened to you?" Margaret thought for a moment. "I want people to see elderly folks. Really see them. We're not invisible. We have stories, we have value, and we deserve to be treated with respect. And I want people to stand up when they see something wrong, the way someone stood up for me." The reporter smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You look absolutely beautiful tonight." As they moved down the carpet, Margaret saw him, Vin Diesel, in a sharp suit, talking to reporters. When he saw her, his whole face lit up. He excused himself from the interview he was doing and walked straight to her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, taking both her hands. "You look incredible." "You clean up pretty nice yourself," Margaret said, and he laughed. The cameras went crazy. Photographers were shouting for them to pose together. Vin put his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she felt a strange sense of pride. Here she was, a 78-year-old widow from a small town, standing on a red carpet with a famous movie star, and it didn't feel wrong. It felt right. "How are you handling all of this?" Vin asked quietly, as photographers continued to snap pictures. "I'm overwhelmed," Margaret admitted. "But I'm okay. Thank you for inviting me. For all of this." "You deserve it," Vin said firmly. "What happened to you sparked an important conversation. You didn't let them make you feel small. That takes courage." They did several interviews together. Vin made sure to credit Margaret every time, talking about her bravery, her grace, how she'd handled an impossible situation with dignity. Margaret felt strange being praised like this, but also strangely empowered. One interviewer asked Vin why he'd decided to intervene that day at the bank. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "My parents taught me to stand up for people who need it. And Mrs. Thompson is exactly the kind of person who deserves someone standing with her. Veterans and their families sacrifice so much for this country. The least we can do is treat them with respect." Inside the theater, Margaret and her family were given seats in the VIP section. She sat between Vin and her daughter, feeling like she was in some kind of dream. The lights went down and the movie started. It was one of those action films James would have loved. Lots of car chases and explosions. Margaret found herself actually enjoying it, getting caught up in the story. During a particularly tense scene, Vin leaned over and whispered, "That stunt nearly killed me," and Margaret had to stifle a laugh. After the movie, there was a reception. Margaret had never been to anything so fancy. Waiters walked around with trays of food she couldn't pronounce. Everyone was beautiful and confident and seemed to know exactly how to act in this world. Margaret felt out of place again until a woman approached her. She was younger, maybe in her 50s, and she had tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I had to tell you. My mother experienced something similar at a doctor's office last year. She was dismissed, treated like she didn't know her own symptoms. She was too embarrassed to tell anyone. But when she saw your story, she finally talked about it. You gave her voice. Thank you." Margaret hugged the stranger, both of them crying a little. This was why it mattered. This was why she'd agreed to do the interviews, to come to this premiere. Not for the glamour or the attention, but because her story might help someone else. Throughout the evening, more people approached her. Some shared their own experiences with discrimination. Others just wanted to thank her for speaking up. Margaret realized that what had happened to her at the bank wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who'd ever been made to feel invisible, who'd been treated as less than human because of their age or race or appearance. Vin kept checking on her throughout the night, making sure she was comfortable, that she had everything she needed. At one point, he introduced her to some of the other actors from the film. They all knew who she was, had seen the videos and interviews. They treated her like she belonged there. Late in the evening, Vin pulled her aside. "I have something for you," he said, handing her an envelope. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside was a check. A large check, made out to the Veterans Affairs Office in memory of James Thompson. "I can't accept this," Margaret said immediately. "It's not for you," Vin said gently. "It's for other veterans' families, so they can get help navigating the system, understanding their benefits, so what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else." Margaret's eyes filled with tears for what felt like the 100th time that day. "James would have loved this. He always said we needed to take better care of our veterans." "Then we're honoring his memory," Vin said. "And yours." The evening wound down around 11. Margaret was exhausted. Her feet hurt from the heels she wasn't used to wearing, but she felt more alive than she had in months, maybe years. As they were leaving, a photographer asked for one more picture. Margaret and Vin posed together, and this time Margaret didn't feel awkward at all. She smiled genuinely, feeling grateful and blessed and seen. In the limousine on the way home, her grandchildren were practically vibrating with excitement, talking over each other about the movie, the stars they'd seen, the food they'd eaten. Her son and daughter were quieter, but Margaret could see the pride in their eyes. "Mom," her daughter said softly, "that was incredible. You were incredible." "I felt like a princess," Margaret admitted.
Is that silly?
"Not at all," her son said. "You deserved every moment of it." When they got back to her house, Margaret carefully hung up the beautiful gown. She washed off the make. The photos from the premiere were everywhere. Margaret woke up the next morning to find pictures of herself in a navy blue gown on news websites, entertainment blogs, and social media platforms she'd never even heard of. Her phone was buzzing constantly with messages from friends, former students, and people she hadn't spoken to in decades. Her daughter made breakfast while Margaret scrolled through the images on her grandson's tablet. "I look so old," she said, studying one close-up photo. "You look distinguished," her daughter corrected. "You look like exactly what you are, a woman who's lived a full life and has nothing to apologize for." But it was true that Margaret looked her age in these photos. The professional photography captured every line on her face, every silver hair. In a world obsessed with youth, here she was, 78 years old and on the red carpet. And somehow that seemed to matter to people. The comments on the photos were mostly positive. People called her elegant, beautiful, inspiring. Some shared stories about their own grandmothers. Others talked about how rare it was to see elderly people celebrated in this way. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's life continued to change in ways she never could have predicted. She received a call from an organization called Advocates for Elder Rights. They wanted her to speak at their annual conference. "I'm not a public speaker," Margaret protested to the woman on the phone. "You don't need to be," the woman replied. "You just need to tell your story. That's what people want to hear." Margaret agreed, though the idea terrified her. She'd taught in classrooms for 40 years. But that was different. Those were children. This would be adults, professionals, people who probably knew much more than she did. Her daughter helped her prepare. They worked on a speech together, kept it simple and honest. Margaret practiced in her living room, her daughter sitting on the couch pretending to be an audience. The conference was in a hotel downtown. Margaret wore a simple dress, nothing fancy like the premiere gown. When she walked into the conference room, there were at least 200 people there. Her heart started racing, but then she thought about that day at the bank. How scared she'd been, how small she'd felt. If she could get through that, she could get through this. She walked to the podium, her hands shaking slightly. She looked out at all those faces and began to speak. "My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 78 years old. I was a middle school English teacher for 40 years. My husband James was a Vietnam veteran and a high school history teacher. We were married for 52 years, and a few months ago I went to deposit his pension check and was accused of fraud." She told them everything. The humiliation at the bank, the way Brad had treated her, how the other customers had watched but said nothing, how Vin Diesel had stepped in when no one else would. "But this isn't really a story about a famous person helping me," Margaret said. "It's a story about how we treat elderly people in this country, about how we make assumptions based on how someone looks, about how easy it is to dismiss someone when they don't have power or influence." She talked about James, about his service and his death, about how lonely the last 6 months had been. about how invisible she'd felt, like she was slowly disappearing from the world. "When you get old, people stop seeing you," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "They look through you instead of at you. You become background noise in your own life." And that day at the bank, I was reminded that I'm not just invisible because I'm elderly. I'm invisible because I'm a Black woman who's elderly. And that makes me even easier to dismiss. The room was completely silent. Margaret could see people wiping their eyes. What happened to me sparked a conversation, but that conversation needs to lead to action. We need better training for people who work with the public. We need stronger protections for elderly citizens. We need to teach young people to respect their elders, to value the wisdom and experience that comes with age. She finished her speech and stood there, unsure what to do next. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Within seconds, the entire room was on their feet, giving her a standing ovation. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Afterwards, dozens of people came up to talk to her. Social workers, policymakers, other elderly people who'd had similar experiences. They shared ideas, made connections, talked about real ways to create change. A woman named Dorothy, who looked to be about Margaret's age, hugged her tightly. "Thank you for saying what so many of us have felt. I've been invisible for 10 years, ever since my husband died. You made me feel seen again." That evening, Margaret drove home feeling exhausted but purposeful. For the first time since James died, she felt like she had something to do, a reason to get up in the morning beyond just existing. The calls kept coming. A local news station wanted to do a follow-up story. A podcast about social justice wanted to interview her. A publisher reached out about writing a book. Margaret turned down the book deal. "I'm not a writer," she told them. But she did agree to more speaking engagements. She talked at senior centers, at community organizations, at a training session for bank employees. First National Bank asked her to consult on their new customer service program. They were developing training materials to help employees understand implicit bias and treat all customers with respect. They wanted Margaret's input, wanted her to share her perspective. It felt strange going back to that bank. Margaret stood in the lobby where she'd been humiliated, but this time it was different. This time people knew who she was. The tellers smiled at her warmly. Susan Chen greeted her personally. They spent hours going through the training materials. Margaret didn't hold back. She pointed out assumptions in the language, places where the materials didn't go far enough. "You need to make people understand that elderly customers aren't confused or incompetent," she said firmly. "We're just older. Our minds still work. We still have value." The program they developed together became a model. Other banks started reaching out, wanting to implement similar training. Margaret found herself consulting for multiple financial institutions, helping them understand how to better serve elderly customers. 6 months after the incident at the bank, Margaret received a call from Veterans Affairs. They wanted to create a program to help veterans' families navigate the benefit system. They'd received Vin's donation and wanted Margaret to help design the program. "We want to name it the James Thompson Family Support Program," they told her. "In honor of your husband's service." Margaret sat down hard in her kitchen chair. James's name would be on a program that would help thousands of families. He'd be remembered, not just by her, but by everyone who benefited from the support. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, he would have loved that. She worked with the VA for months, helping create resources, training counselors, making sure the program was accessible and respectful. She thought about all the families like hers, widows and widowers trying to navigate a complex system while grieving. Now they'd have help. Vin kept his promise about staying in touch. They didn't talk often. He was busy filming and she was busy with her advocacy work, but they'd text occasionally. He'd send her pictures from movie sets. She'd send him updates about the programs she was working on. One day, he called her. "Mrs. Thompson, I have an idea I want to run past you." He was working with a foundation that supported elderly care. They wanted to create a campaign about respecting elders, fighting ageism, supporting senior citizens. They wanted Margaret to be the face of it. "Me?" Margaret said. "Why me?" "Because you're authentic. People connect with you. You're not some celebrity or politician. You're a real person who experienced something real, and you turned it into something positive." Margaret thought about it for a long time. Part of her wanted to go back to her quiet life, to just be a grandmother who volunteered at the library. But another part of her, the part that had woken up after that day at the bank, knew she couldn't. She accepted. The campaign launched 3 months later. There were billboards with Margaret's face, public service announcements, social media posts. The tagline was simple: "We all get old. Treat people how you want to be treated." Margaret did interviews for the campaign, sharing her story and encouraging people to think about how they treated elderly people in their lives. The response was overwhelming. The campaign sparked conversations about ageism, about how society treats the elderly, about the value of experience and wisdom. Her children were proud, but also slightly worried. "Mom, you're doing so much. Are you sure you're not overdoing it?" Margaret laughed. "I spent 6 months sitting in this house feeling sorry for myself, missing your father. Now I'm actually doing something that matters. I'm honoring James's memory and helping people. I've never felt more alive." On what would have been her and James's 53rd anniversary, Margaret visited his grave. She told him about everything that had happened, about the premiere and the speaking engagements and the program with his name on it. "I wish you were here to see all this," she said, touching his headstone. "But I think you'd be proud. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm actually living, Morris. The advocacy,